Perhaps no single feature of American life is more emblematic of the fabled American dream than the living arrangement of the modern residential suburb. Sprawling housing developments, large yards, trash collection, air conditioning. This bargain once allowed the working class to escape the bleakness of industrial cities and carve out a slice of family-friendly living. What started as an expression of our nation's deterministic frontier mindset has evolved into the lifestyle aspiration of millions. But has it been worth it? Has it made us happier, safer, or more free? Did suburbia deliver on its promise to build secure citizen communities, a perfect place for raising children, and the embodiment of our national spirit? One thing is for sure. This living arrangement can't go on forever, and things that can't go on forever don't.
You'll find a scene like this in nearly every village, town, and city throughout the country. For in the hopes and dreams of everyone, there's a home they can call their own. Home brings a sense of security to a man. And to every woman, her home means a setting for gracious living.
And we'll have the living room right in here. And the kitchen right here so we can see the children playing in the yard. And we have shrubbery, of course, right along in here. And, oh, darling, it's going to be just perfect.
At its inception, the concept of industrial cities and towns was a very new phenomenon. And by the mid-1800s, the American industrial city had become, by all accounts, a terrible place to live.
The dream of the suburbs was the antidote to city life, and in particular, the life of the industrial city and the industrial town. And the antidote was going to be country living for everybody. And the suburbs was a way of delivering that to the masses. And they were moving to real countryside. There were no Kmarts in 1897.
After the turn of the century, with the invention of the automobile and an expanding industrial economy, car-based suburbs led to abandonment and even outright destruction of the comprehensive streetcar and urban light rail systems, trashed in the name of progress. This suburban project continued after the end of the First World War, with the advent of the personal automobile, until the crash of 1929 put a stop to these expansionist construction efforts, with the Great Depression preventing any more investment in the suburban living arrangement. And by the 1940s, the United States was faced with another challenge.
No, sir. All this can't keep a fella from putting down his ideas. Something is going to add up here. His own air-conditioned castle with a deep freeze. Cooler for beer. Great big lawn where Bet and Pubsy will welcome him home. The Veterans Emergency Housing Program is launched to help solve the housing emergency in hundreds of cities. The target, 2,700,000 homes and apartments started by the end of 1947.
America went from descending into a Second World War in the midst of the Great Depression to surfacing ideally positioned to rule global trade and manufacturing for the foreseeable future. Being shielded by two vast oceans, the United States was spared the ravages of war, and American factories, oil wells, coal mines, and infrastructure remained untouched.
This is the payoff to our soldiers who fought in World War II. You get to come home. You don't have to live in a city anymore. You can live in a brand new home in the suburbs, and you're going to have a wife who can stay at home and a family, and that's the payout. And that became a packaged American dream.
Our nation was at last feeling financially stable after decades of economic turbulence, and by the 1950s, the suburban revolution exploded. It created a feedback loop of growth, with more suburban development amplifying an already growing economy.
You get the real full elaboration of the automobile suburb based on the idea of the cul-de-sac subdivision, and that becomes the template for how we're going to build things. And this is the only part of the world at that time where, plumbers and pipe fitters and sheetrock hangers could own their own home.
By the 1960s, the suburbs were a predictable and sheltered arrangement for those who lived there, and were also responsible for the equally secure livelihoods of those who built them, sold them, furnished them, and delivered to them. Home values steadily increased, and the entire system worked as designed. The 60s also saw the creation of a brand new suburban establishment, the indoor shopping mall, which created enormous growth potential for business in the areas outside the older cities. It also eliminated the need for suburban dwellers to drive back into the city centers to shop for clothes, buy furniture, or go to the movies. All of the entertainment and adornments of this new living arrangement were just a cheap car ride away.
The American city is decanted into the countryside, and all of its functions soon follow. The shopping, the office, the retail, everything follows.
A new way of life was erupting, completely independent of any framework that remained in the old cities and industrial centers, which were becoming increasingly bleak and dilapidated after decades of depression and disinvestment, made even worse by the mass exodus to the hinterlands. Decade after decade, the construction of ever-expanding suburbs was arguably the core of America's economy, at least until the 2008 housing market crash, an event that left much of suburbia heavily devalued. The dream of the suburbs wasn't based in anything exceptional or pragmatic about the suburbs themselves. They unfortunately shared many of the worst qualities of both the city and country life, but it was a visible testament to American exceptionalism and the limitless potential of our free market. The United States regrettably spent the better part of a century sinking huge amounts of its accumulated wealth and material resources into a living arrangement and an infrastructure that is painfully dependent on cheap oil and natural gas, and we will soon be without both the energy needed to run it and the capital needed to replace it. We won't be building many more of these environments, and as we move past the age of affordable and abundant energy, these regions of the landscape will ultimately forfeit their usefulness. Enormous stretches of land that millions of Americans call home were built on an expectation of perpetual growth, and their time has run out.
Just as the air can be polluted, water supplies wasted, so our land can be dissipated and despoiled. Today, the land surrounding our metropolitan areas is being swallowed up at the rate of 1 million acres a year.
At the same time that suburbia was extending across the American landscape, a considerable block of lobbying interests, including the automotive, trucking, oil, tire, steel, and construction industries, got behind what would ultimately become the Interstate Highway Act. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower appointed a committee to study the plan, chaired by Lucius D. Clay, who at the time just so happened to be sitting on the board of directors for General Motors.
The most talked about phase of the act is the interstate highway system, a 41,000-mile network of our most important roads. Most of these roads will be 4, 6, even 8-lane expressways constructed for through traffic. They will take the over-the-road driver from city to city, coast to coast, at highway speeds, even through large population centers.
Unsurprisingly, Congress approved the act, and 41,000 miles of new expressways were underway, with massive investments in highway infrastructure and even the widening of ordinary local roads. Public transit options withered. electric streetcar systems were shut down or discontinued, as bus lines were cheaper and faster to build. Americans also increasingly preferred the comfort of their personal automobile, rather than crowded trolleys that would drop them off blocks from their destination. Unlike automobiles, which had previously been heavily subsidized, streetcar systems had to operate as private companies, received little to no public funding, and faced the threat of organized automobile interests actively conspiring to kill them off.
The growth of suburbs has brought another major problem: getting there and back. Without cars, suburbia wouldn't be possible. But once we live in suburbia, even where there are trains and buses serving the suburbs, most people have to depend on cars. Each year there are more of them. Each year there must be more highways and expressways to take care of them.
For the vast majority of Americans, our living arrangement today is overwhelmingly dependent on the personal automobile. The average American spends a total of 9 days per year sitting in their car commuting to work and back. A 100-mile daily commute is not uncommon. Traffic jams alone cost the United States $87 billion in 2018. In much of the country, owning and driving a car is not a privilege, but an absolute prerequisite for securing employment. Very often in our suburban environments, it's fundamentally necessary for families to own 2 cars so that 2 working adults can drive vast distances to their respective jobs. The cost of gassing up, repairing, insuring, and driving these cars absolutely everywhere dooms many families to a life of automobile-fueled poverty. It can make it impossible for them to own their own home, to maintain their financial well-being, or even to stay together at all. On top of this, in recent decades, dozens of states have begun using driver's license suspension as a punitive measure for things like missing a court date, the inability to pay court fees, or drug possession. Things the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators refers to as social nonconformance.
Stephanie can't get her license back because she still owes over $10,000 to 5 different courts in Virginia for drug possession. Even though she served her time, under Virginia law, she can't drive until she pays these fees with interest. It's a catch-22. Stephanie doesn't work enough to pay off her debts, but to work more, she would need to drive.
Something as simple as an unpaid parking ticket can compound into a cascading series of fines and penalties, leaving Americans with a difficult choice. Drive with a suspended license and risk jail time and more debt, or don't drive at all and risk poverty and unemployment. The car-dependent style of urban development exacerbates Americans' preference for individual motoring. Useful buildings are replaced with sprawling parking lots. Open-air shopping streets are replaced with giant indoor shopping malls. Roads become even bigger, which actually makes traffic even worse, makes public transit even less viable, and makes reaching destinations even more difficult without a car.
You know, at some point or another, they will get into the subject of, we've got an energy problem and, we've got this car dependency problem. What are we going to do? Invariably, the conversation turns to only one thing: running the cars heroically by other means. We'll have electric cars, we'll have hybrids. They don't want to talk about walkable neighborhoods. They don't want to talk about smaller cities that function in an integral way. They don't want to talk about any of that. It's such a striking failure of this culture to have a coherent conversation from the people who ought to be leading it. Because if those people can't talk coherently about car dependency in relation to our oil situation, who are we going to depend on?
In a future without democratized automobile ownership and cheap, abundant petroleum, this geography will be worse than useless, as huge amounts of Americans will be unable to afford the luxury of shuttling many miles between areas of retail, employment, and the suburbs. Businesses may struggle to stay afloat, stranded in isolated islands of development far away from their customers and employees.
We have created this new system of habitation where people live miles and miles from where they work and from where they get their food and all of their other necessities. based on the idea that they can and they must hop in their car at any moment and travel miles and miles. And the only way that works is on the basis of cheap energy.
It was a mistake to plan our communities around the needs of the personal automobile, instead of the needs of our citizens, and its compounding negative effects aren't waiting for the end of cheap energy. They're already here.
The immersive ugliness of our everyday environments in America is entropy made visible. We can't overestimate the amount of despair that we are generating with places like this. We have to do better if we're going to continue the project of civilization in America.
It's not just the agony of rush hour commuting that has contaminated the suburban living arrangement. The sheer unsightliness of these sprawling landscapes is not just a matter of architectural taste. It has converted vast swaths of our country into places that are simply not worth caring about, which has had a very real effect on our levels of anxiety and despair, as enormous portions of the suburban citizens' worldview continue to be constructed by what they see through their car windshield. Much of the aimlessness of our suburban arrangement has to do with the disintegration of human activities as a result of single-use zoning. The government-enforced mandate outlawing the building of a corner store, a laundromat, or a local restaurant within these neighborhoods. Businesses that could enhance the quality of life of those who lived there, in addition to providing an opportunity for employees to live closer to where they work. Children suffer from this form of social poverty as well. The suburbs don't afford children the luxury of casually roaming their communities or socializing with friends, absent an adult-arranged playdate. Suburban parents hold the paradoxical view that the decision to live in suburbia is necessary to find a safe place to raise children, yet they are extremely reluctant to grant children the independence to venture out on their own in these so-called safe environments. Nonetheless, even if suburban parents were open to this idea, their children would be extremely lucky to live within walking distance of any public space or center for entertainment or commerce. Common destinations for today's children are either too far to travel without a car or require a journey too difficult and dangerous because of a lack of sidewalks or pedestrian paths. Without a parent acting as chauffeur, American children are increasingly stranded indoors or left to play near their homes inside a cul-de-sac monoculture. Unlike previous generations, they are completely isolated from adults going about their daily business, in places of commerce and socialization. Boys especially are prevented from the adventures of meandering and exploration that are critical to their social development and independence, and are spending increasing amounts of time indoors, watching television or consuming other digital media.
In another community in New Jersey, the houses are so far apart that it makes trick-or-treating really hard on Halloween. The parents are worried that the kids are going to get exhausted, it would be not safe, there's no sidewalks. The kids would never get enough candy at that kind of density level to be happy. So instead, the parents decided to have everybody drive to the local K-8 school, park their cars in tailgate formation, and the kids trick-or-treated from car to car. But it just goes to show you how far we've come from organic, natural communities that we have to build them out of cars.
In places like the Netherlands, where walkable neighborhoods and human-scale urban design is the norm, it's extremely common to see even young children biking to school, walking to a friend's house, or even running errands for their parents. But this is something that is essentially unheard of in American suburban areas, with the reason being that it's just not safe. In 1961, author and urban activist Jane Jacobs referred to an effect called eyes on the street, describing the idea that places with a lot of people around feel safer than places that are deserted. How many hundreds of automobile-encased people would drive by without noticing if something were to happen to your child in this setting? American-style, car-dependent suburban environments are desolate, depressing, and dangerous for pedestrians, Because these environments are designed exclusively for cars, pedestrian deaths have increased significantly in recent decades, following an increase in the number of cars on the road, instances of distracted driving, and increased vehicle speeds. In 2018, a pedestrian was struck and killed by a car every 84 minutes, and pedestrian fatalities have increased 41% since 2008. Even our political and social discourse suffers from this arrangement. Public gathering spaces and real face-to-face conversations have been replaced by coercive political advertising poured into the suburban home through television and social media. Citizens become more disconnected from one another and more isolated in self-reinforcing bubbles, as opposing political factions operate on entirely different sets of facts. Much of the American landscape has been assembled in tragic fashion, with enormous highways, vast parking lots, endless housing tracts, and overrun countryside. Unfortunately, these distressing and unappealing components make up the everyday habitat where millions of Americans live and work, with the only reprieve being that citizens can quickly escape these dreary and poorly planned environments in the comfort of their automobile. The colossal suburbs developed in the last few decades have contributed to harrowing amounts of loneliness, alienation, anxiety, and depression, and the people of the United States might be better off without this misguided experiment. But the task of restoring American residential life is going to be difficult.
Consequently, these will be places that nobody wants to be in. These will be places that are not worth caring about. We have about 38,000 places that are not worth caring about in the United States today. When we have enough of them, we're going to have a nation that's not worth defending. And I want you to think about that when you think about those young men and women who are over in places like Iraq spilling their blood in the sand, and ask yourself, what is their last thought of home? I hope it's not the curb cut between the Chuck E. Cheese and the Target store, because that's not good enough for Americans.
The suburban experiment was a pleasant and convenient way to inhabit our nation during the period in which conditions made it possible. But now that those conditions are changing, we're going to see the end of it. And with it, massive changes in the way we arrange our communities and resources. For starters, communities will have much lower access to mass-produced or modular systems of building. We will instead need to rely on traditional skills like masonry and carpentry, using easily obtainable materials that are locally available. The setting of the suburban housing tract may very well turn into a stockpile of abandoned raw materials, feeding the shanty towns of the permanently poor of the future, as we become more reliant on reusing materials that were energy intensive to produce in the first place. All of this suburban real estate will continue down a path of rapid devaluation, and many of these portraits of American exceptionalism will instead become the slums of the post-fossil fuel era.
We're dependent on oil for about 95% of our transportation: planes, trains, automobiles, ships. Basically, if the oil stops flowing, our society starts coming apart at the seams.
The suburbs that were really built after the 1960s, the ones that are really past the inner rings, are going to become pretty deeply dysfunctional. We may see, more than one family living in a McMansion, and we may see them growing crops on what used to be the front lawn. I think we're going to see a meltdown in the value of this living arrangement that we've created in North America. This tremendous infrastructure for daily life that is not going to function very well in a world that doesn't have cheap fossil fuel. The crux of the issue, I think, for most ordinary people is we're going to have to live more locally. And we're going to have to at least prepare mentally to do that. The suburban idea, really, as it has been known in the late 20th century, is really coming to an end.
The unfortunate truth is that the majority of suburbia is unsalvageable. It is simply not constructed in a way that lends itself to being retrofitted into the sort of human-scale, mixed-use, walkable habitats that Americans will require in order to continue daily life in an age of greatly reduced automobile use. These environments have no place in an age without cheap oil, and the future is destined to be more about staying where you are rather than constantly driving from place to place. Our food will have to be produced closer to where we live, and will probably require more intensive labor. The world will cease shrinking, and life will become radically and increasingly local. Well before the year 2100, electricity will revert back to what it was in 1900, an urban luxury afforded mainly to the wealthy and generated by less energy-dense sources like wind, hydroelectric, and solar. Fossil fuels and cheap personal transportation will be a memory, and cities will have their own modest yet sustainable electric grids, providing practical amounts of light and power to the homes and businesses that can afford it.
Alternative energies are going to be, at best, small lifeboats made available in local communities by people who say, nobody's going to do this for me. We have to do it for ourselves. We have to get solar in our neighborhood to wire our apartment. Right now, we have to spend whatever it takes because the grid's going to go down. Survival will happen from a local basis, and we're going to see local economies. That's the only way the human race is going to survive.
What will end up being the legacy of our giant suburban experiment? Painters and historians once lamented the loss of the material ruins and remnants of ancient civilizations, and traveled to distant lands to be awed by decaying aqueducts and classical architecture. Unfortunately, the ruins of our civilization seem doomed to consist of fast food restaurants and big box retail buildings. It will be a distressing, if not accurate, testament to the 20th century American perspective. What can you do to better prepare yourself for a world in which suburbs and car dependency are impossible choices for arranging everyday life? For one, you can help rediscover and repropagate the principles of intelligent urban design. You can petition your community representatives to embrace human-scale neighborhoods and to reform zoning laws and street design in a way that contributes to communities that are walkable, diverse, pragmatic, and most importantly, not dependent on nor designed for the personal automobile. If you're able, try to establish yourself in an area that accommodates multimodal transportation and features public spaces that are worth caring about. Many of these places are old-fashioned, mixed-use neighborhoods that include homes, businesses, and schools, all within easy reach of one another. Do not allow a primary influx of crises to find you living in a suburban home, many miles from the nearest source of food, medicine, or employment. If you can, get rid of your car. If this requires you to move, then get a new job closer to where you'll be living, or change your lifestyle. If you can't get rid of your car, trade it in for the lightest and most efficient model you can, and practice dealing with blackouts, higher gas prices, and all other forms of energy shortages. We will sooner or later be no stranger to them on our long descent.
Oh Lord, heaven's waiting, open up your door. Oh Lord, heaven's waiting, open up your door. Lead me home, lead me home, lead me home. Lead me